Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Thank you for joining Lake Bluff Library. This is like one night I think we're all happy to have Zoom because we don't have to go out in 11 degrees and snow. So I appreciate your joining us this evening. Before our speaker gets started, I just wanted to remind you that on Thursday night of this week at 7 o'clock, we have a program on pre-Civil War quilts. It'll be about quilts and their signals with the Underground Railroad, not a typical quilt show. She will show actual quilts, but she's more about explaining the meanings behind them. So tonight we have Justin Witte, who is from the College of DuPage. He is the curator for the Frida Kahlo exhibit that will be there this summer at the, I want to make sure I say this correctly, the Cleve Carney Art Gallery. They had planned to do this last summer, and of course it got canceled, so they're trying again this summer. But Justin will tell you about the exhibit and how you can get tickets and all of that, and his role in all this. So Justin, I'll let you take over.
Thanks, Carol.
You're welcome.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for turning on your computers tonight. I first just want to say to Carol and everyone at the library, and those of you who maybe came out last year, I'm sorry. I had a scheduled lecture last year and I ended up being double booked and I didn't make it, and I left some people waiting, and I just want to apologize, but I'm glad we're here today to talk about this show. So in a minute, I'm going to bring up a slideshow. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the artist Frida Kahlo and some of her work, and then talk about our exhibit coming up at the College of DuPage at the Cleve Carney Museum of Art. And then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Right. So first thing I should talk about is actually the title of the exhibit. When we first started planning the show, which was actually in 2017, we came on the idea of actually naming the show Frida Kahlo 2020 because in studying Frida Kahlo's life and her times, we found a lot of parallels that were happening in the world at that time leading up to 2020. There was a lot of discussion of economic disparity. There was issues related around women's rights. There were issues related about, the rights of the working class. There's issues about our relationships with Mexico. And all these things really played into, and we thought it was really a relevant show for that time. And then obviously, in March of last year, our world, along with everyone else's, completely changed. And then as we went back to start thinking about how we would represent the show in 2021, an interesting realization happened is that while it was no longer the same time and our focus had shifted, we could not think about the reality we were in this pandemic and other issues going on. But we found ourselves going through a year where we were isolated from those around us, from those that we loved, that we were dealing with the effects of illness on some of ourselves and also on our society, and of loss. And those are all issues that Frida dealt with intimately in her life. And in realizing that, the thing that we're still drawn to was how she overcame those issues. And just as when we're thinking about the show Frida Kahlo 2020, it was how she dealt with those issues for a time, her strength. And then as I was looking back at all the different periods of time in which Frida has been so popular, because really, especially in the US, it's been since the late 70s, early 80s, especially after the publication of the artist Hayden Herrera's biography of Frida Kahlo, that she's been incredibly popular and only grown in popularity. And there's all these different generations that continue to be drawn to her. And I think it's really that strength, whether it's in the face of the adversity of her time or in the face of her own personal struggles. She was a strong, powerful, individual who really charted her own history, her own path. And in that draw really is timeless. So that's kind of how we came across the new name. So I would like to start, if I can get my slides to advance here. Okay, with a bit about the artist herself, understanding that not everyone necessarily knows who she is. You may see her on socks or murals, but you don't really know her true story. So Frida was born in a very interesting time in Mexico City. Actually, it was in Coyoacan, which at the time was a suburb of Mexico City, about an hour from the center of Mexico City. She was born in 1907. She was born to a German-Hungarian father who was actually a photographer, Guillermo Kahlo, and he actually worked for the federal government photographing architectural and historic locations in Mexico. And then her mother was a mestiza, which is a mixed heritage between Spanish descent and indigenous Mexican descent. And it was from her father that she really grew up around an artist studio. He had a studio in their house. She often posed for him, and photographs, helped him take photographs. And her mother really connected her to her Mexican roots and also to like a strict religious Catholic upbringing. So the kind of iconography that was in that. And she was also born 3 years before the beginning of the Mexican Revolution, which was very pivotal. The Mexican Revolution, which was a reaction to the 30-year dictatorial presidency of Porfirio Diaz, it's often called the Porfiriato, was a 10-year period from 1910 to 1920, where the country first rose up and overthrew Porfirio Diaz, but then went through a series of different presidents. It was a very turbulent kind of violent time. And at the end of that period, the government coming out in 1920 wanted to really re-engage the Mexican people and give them a sense of identity. And part of that is they really grabbed onto a lot of the ideas of the revolution that went back into looking at the history of Mexico, developing a national pride in Mexico, and a pride in the indigenous history of Mexico, pre-Columbian times. And it was through that period, all of these ideas happening, that Frida was growing up. Another key event as she's growing up, when she was age 6 in 1913, she developed polio. And in her recovery, like a lot of people with polio, it left her with one leg that was less developed and shorter than the other, her right leg. And her parents, at the advice of doctors, really encouraged her at time to take in a lot of sports to kind of strengthen that leg. You often hear that story about Teddy Roosevelt, how one way he like really came to love the outdoors, right, was his recovery from polio. It was the same with Frida. She was encouraged to play soccer, go swimming, ride bikes, but often it was with other boys in the neighborhood in Coyoacan, and they would make fun of her. They'd call her pencil leg because of her shriveled leg. And so very early on, she developed this kind of thick skin, how to deal with kind of being mocked, made fun of, how to deal with being different. But she also started to develop strategies to kind of hide her leg, like wearing double, triple socks on that leg, disguising it different ways. So very early, she became aware of how to use her appearance to kind of disguise the things going on with her body, which would play into her later in life. In 1922, she was one of only 35 women who entered the prestigious National Preparatory School. This was after the revolution. The Ministry of Education really worked hard in Mexico to use the schools as sources for developing this new sense of a national pride, this Mexicanidad, this kind of pride in being Mexican, this engagement in its history. And the schools were filled with really engaging philosophers and thinkers and artists. And the students at these schools, especially the National Preparatory School, were very much involved in the conversations of the time. So when Frida showed up in 1922, she was entering a very prestigious school that was a center for intellectual and artistic thought. And immediately she fell in with a group of students who were known for their intellect, but also kind of as pranksters. They all wore the same kind of peaked 1920s hats, like the caps, like newsy caps. And because of that, they were called Las Cachucas, which is the name for that hat in Spanish. And they would really engage in a lot of the thoughts and ideas of the times, look at art, discuss things, but they'd also do things like light off dynamite outside the auditorium during lectures. Or when a famous artist from Mexico, Diego Rivera, came to the school to paint a mural commissioned by the Department of Education, they would spy on him. Frida would yell down at the balcony at the auditorium where he was painting at him to distract him. They would even set fire to his scaffolding as he worked. So it was kind of a wild kind of Hogwarts kind of place, I imagine it. But it was this fascinating center that was really feeding the intellect of the students, and it was really helping form who Frida was. When she was 18, she was actually leaving the school in 1925 with her boyfriend at the time, Alejandro Gomez, and they were taking a bus back to Coyoacan. Now, buses at the time were not as buses as we think of them now. They weren't big, large metal cars, very safe, but they're actually more like large flatbed trucks with kind of a wooden box on the end with wooden benches in it, almost like a very rudimentary wooden streetcar. And you'd sit in the benches and you would drive through the streets of Mexico, which really was a city where streetcars and electricity and traffic were fairly new, right? A lot of the modernization of Mexico really only began happening in the very late 1800s, early 1900s. So all these people were figuring out how to navigate this city where there were still horses on the streets, with trams, with buses. And so she gets on this bus to go home, and they're darting through traffic. She noted later that the bus driver was very young and he seemed nervous. And he swerved to pass another vehicle. And as he did that, the bus was T-boned by a streetcar. Now, the way I like to describe it is if you imagine you have like a bundle of sticks all at once, if you slowly bend them and give them pressure, they don't snap cleanly. The pressure builds up and they kind of burst open on one side away from where you're bending it. And this bus, since it was hitting the side by the tram, was described as excruciatingly pushed along and bent, and the pressure built up until finally it kind of exploded. And many of the passengers were thrown from the bus, including Frida. Frida was thrown from the bus, her clothes were ripped off of her, and actually a metal handrail from the bus impaled her, going from her pelvis out of her spine. So she was laying in the middle of the street when this happened with this handrail impaled through her body. She had lost her clothes. Her hair was up in a bun, so she looked like a dancer, and everyone was saying, "The ballerina, the ballerina." And there had been a sign painter in the bus as well who had gold leaf, because back then they would do gold leaf on windows for the signs, right? And this gold leaf had fallen on her. So she was in this incredibly dramatic tableau on the ground, and everyone was screaming and didn't know what to do. Luckily, Alejandro was miraculously unharmed in this accident. And he went to her side, and he and then a stranger on the street, a gentleman, came over, and they actually removed the steel rod from her body just there on the street. And then they lifted her up and carried her to a pool table that had actually been exposed in a broken window in the accident. When the Red Cross came and they saw Frida, they thought it was a lost cause, and they wanted to spend their time on people they could save. But Alejandro pleaded with them, so they took her to the Red Cross hospital, where she spent a number of months, and she was in a full body cast, and then she was released home, where she's then spent half a year in bed recovering, and had a short recovery, and then actually relapsed, and then was in bed for over a year recovering from this accident. And it was in this bed, in this recovery period, where she didn't have much to do. She was this young woman who had been planning on studying medicine. She was very engaged in being the center of the capital, the largest city in Mexico, at this moment of incredible intellectual and artistic thought. And she was back out in the suburbs, right? Back in Coyoacan, in this sleepy but beautiful area. And she was bored out of her mind. And she also didn't know what she was going to do with her life, because she didn't want to go back to school because all her friends were moving on and she didn't want to be alone. Well, obviously she knew from her father that you could be an artist, and she thought maybe she would, both to deal with her boredom and maybe as a career, start painting. So using her father's paint set, her parents had a carpenter make a special easel for her that she could use while she was in bed, and she began painting. She started painting the people around her, friends and family, and then obviously the other person she could paint was herself. And to aid with that, at the top of her bed, there was a wooden canopy on the top of her bed, and her mother had installed on the bottom of it a mirror so she could look down on herself and start to study her as one of her main subjects. As she recovered, here's the bed here on the right. That's actually from the Blue House, Frida Kahlo Museum in Mexico City. You can see the mirror on the top, and it was her bed throughout her life. And on the left, you see models of what the bus and tram would have looked like. And these are based on an unfinished ex voto painting that Frida did of the accident. It's the only painting she actually attempted to ever do of the accident. And for those of you who don't know, an ex voto is typically a small religious painting done on tin, similar to a retablo, that is done to either document or ask for a miracle. So a lot of times people who recover from a disease or something pay to have these made, and then they're installed above the altar of a saint as thanks, or people who want a miracle to happen do that. And she had painted one of the bus accident, and we had these models created based on the images in that painting, and they'll be included in the show. So as she recovered, she decided, well, I'm gonna be a painter. So she started going around and seeking out other artists to look at her work. And one story has it, and one thing you have to remember about Frida is there's many different stories about her life because she often told contradictory stories about her own life. So one story about how this went down is she went to where Diego, this painter who had been working at her school, the National Preparatory School when she was younger, was working on a mural. The most famous artist in Mexico. He had been in Paris before the revolution. Everyone knew who he was. Called him down to look at her paintings. There are other stories that they were actually introduced through their mutual friend Tino Modari, the famous photographer. But however, they first initially actually met, whether it was at the school or when she called him down from the scaffolding or through Tino Modari. When they met, it was clear that Diego was drawn to this young artist, not only for her skill, but also, as his reputation would suggest, her young age and beauty. And the two became very close, and eventually they married in 1929. She was 22, he was 42. You see them on the right here, their marriage photography. You can see he's a real ladies' man, real handsome gentleman. He actually was a ladies' man, but he was not at all attractive. He was known as kind of this rotund, frog-like guy. And in fact, Frida's mother did not attend the wedding and described their pairing as the marriage of the dove and the elephant. I'm not sure who was who in that comparison, but I'm gonna guess that she meant Frida was the dove. The two were married, and it was an amazing thing because just not long after this action she began painting, she's married to the most famous artist in the world, and she's meeting some of the most famous artists in Mexico. And shortly after they're married, meeting some of the most famous artists in the world. On the left here is a mural by Diego Rivera at the National Palace with the history of Mexico, to give you a sense of the type of murals that he was creating at the time. He, of course, most known being one of the big three muralists in Mexico. He was also a very accomplished easel painter as well. So as money from the Department of Education started to dry up for murals, a lot of muralists started to go abroad to paint commission work, and Diego Rivera was one of them. In 1930, he and his young wife moved to the United States to work on a series of commissions, first in San Francisco. This is the first time Frida had left Mexico, first time she was in the United States. She was this young artist, married to this larger-than-life, internationally known painter, and traveling to the US by train. She was at first really taken by the beauty of the California coast, and she also of San Francisco. When they moved there, she didn't work a whole lot at first, working from different models in the area, working on different paintings, a lot of which we have in our exhibition. But she spent a lot of time like wandering the streets. She loved Chinatown in San Francisco. She loved the fabrics and the silks and the colors. She loved going to movies, and she socialized quite a bit as well. You have to remember, even though they were very much supporters of kind of at the time, Diego Rivera had been an ardent communist. They were very supportive of the cause of revolution, but he was commissioned by industrialists and capitalists in the US, and they were hobnobbing with the rich and famous, and Frida kind of loved that. From San Francisco, they moved the first time they moved to New York was after that. Frida liked that as well. And then she had a little problem there, and also San Francisco, with the disparity she saw in the country. She was really shocked that in the US, there was so much difference between the rich and the poor. And remember, this is during the Great Depression, so that was exacerbated. Towns have shanty towns on the edge of them. But at the same time, she was really drawn to the culture. In 1932, they moved to Detroit, where Diego was commissioned to work on a mural at the Institute of Art. And it was in Detroit that a very pivotal event happened in Frida's life. First of all, unlike San Francisco or New York, where Frida really stood out because of the way she dressed in her Tijuana-styled clothing, her hair done up with flowers, a very beautiful, kind of striking woman. That look in Detroit in the 1930s, this Midwestern industrial city in the 30s, elicited a different reaction. People saw it as different and other, to be suspected. They also, when they first moved, were the guests of the Ford family, who were helping to fund the mural, and they were at a dinner with the Fords. And both Frida and Diego had a Jewish ancestry. While it's not totally clear on Frida's side if that's the case, there's a lot of evidence that her father actually was Jewish, and Diego also was of Jewish descent. And she called out Henry Ford at this dinner party, this fancy dinner party, for his anti-Semitic views. And in fact, they were even put up in a hotel that refused to rent rooms to Jewish people at the time. And Diego and Frida said they would not stay there until they changed that policy, which they did. So her entrance to Detroit was very rough, and it was winter. So this is someone from Mexico City. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. It's a very temperate climate, a beautiful climate. In the winters, you're talking still highs in the 70s, doesn't get much below 50 at night. It's a beautiful kind of tropical mountain landscape. If anyone's ever been to the Central Park in Mexico City, it's just this lush, beautiful, otherworldly experience. She's used to that locale, and here she is in peak industry Detroit, and these things are happening. So she's already kind of down. And then another thing has happened. She was hospitalized in 1932 and had a terrible miscarriage. She had been carrying Diego's child, and she had always had difficulties caused by her bus accident, and those also related to her ability to have a child. And she was concerned about if she would be able to have this child, and had written her doctor in ways she could deal with it. And there was a question of whether she should end the pregnancy or not. But she didn't, but then she had this terrible miscarriage. She was drawn in on her own, brought into Henry Ford Hospital, and lost this child. It was a very traumatic experience for her, and put her into this deep depression. And in coming out of it, Diego encouraged her to work through it by creating work. First creating a lithograph about the experience, and then painting a painting called Henry Ford Hospital, which, in the style of an ex voto or retablo, those religious paintings I mentioned, it was small on tin, very unusual for contemporary artists at the time. It depicted her floating in this very barren landscape on this tilted, oversized bed, completely naked, right after the miscarriage. Floating above her is the fetus, a symbol for her uterus. There's a symbol of a machine they use in the operation, a snail that suggested the slow pace of the operation, an anatomical body, a model of the female body, suggesting the medical and compassionless situation there. The painting was kind of shocking. Not many artists at the time painted personal, honest personal portrayals of their life that way. Remember, her husband was painting very propaganda-esque kind of working class paintings, or paintings for murals for industrialists. There was very few, let alone women artists, talking about that, and no women artists talking about something so intimate. Even though it's common as miscarriage, still it's not something that's talked about today, even though millions of women go through that experience every year. And it was such an unusual and startling painting that even Diego commissioned. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen before. And from that point on, a characteristic in Frida's work was kind of the honesty and bravery in which she portrayed her life and her struggles, and that became really hallmarks of who she was. On the right, we see a painting that was actually painted in San Francisco. It's also a very pivotal painting. It's a portrait of Luther Burbank. It was painted actually after he had already died. Luther Burbank was a famous horticulturalist, excuse me, known for his research and development of hybrid plants. He was also a pacifist and a very outspoken, he was very outspoken about his political beliefs. And Frida was very drawn to him and his writings and his beliefs, and they visited his grave with his wife, and she made this portrait of him, this posthumous portrait of him. And it's very pivotal because it shows a few characteristics that also appear in Frida's work. One is the hybrid form. So here we see Luther Burbank, the inventor of hybrid plants, not the inventor, but a researcher in them, as a hybrid himself. So his legs kind of morph into this trunk of a tree, then roots go out, and the roots are actually then feeding from his buried body. Okay. And then in his hand, he's holding the plant, the connection with his work. And then the tree that is also him is also feeding from himself and giving new life. Now, Frida was, like a lot of people in Mexico City after the revolution, really interested in pre-Columbian beliefs. And a lot of those were also spiritual beliefs, similar to cosmovision or other beliefs of the world. And a lot of those are rooted in the duality of all aspects of life. And a big component of that is the parallel of life and death. And even to this day, in Mexico, there's much more comfortable relationship with death than there is in the United States. Think of Day of the Dead as a very popular example, a whole celebration in which people celebrate, honor, and spend time with those who have passed away. So there's more comfort, this idea that those who die don't leave you, this idea that death is also a beginning, that life and death are part of this cyclical movement through your experience, your spiritual experience. So that's represented also in this painting. So you have Luther gaining energy and life from his own buried body in that continuum, which is also very related to plant life, right? The annual kind of birth, growth, death, and then spring, the rebirth of plants. That's also something that really appears over and over again in Frida's work. So up until this time, Frida had just been painting kind of to herself, showing her paintings to Diego and his friends. Of course, his friends were some of the most famous artists in the world. When they were in New York, which they visited twice, they also ended their time in New York, where Diego was commissioned to paint a mural by Nelson Rockefeller, which was eventually destroyed because at the center of the mural, he depicted Lenin as the hero of the mural. Rockefeller asked him to remove that figure, but under pressure from his assistants and other people in the Communist Party, he actually refused. So he was fired, and then the mural was later destroyed. And after they were fired, they ran out of money and had to return to Mexico. When they returned to Mexico, she continued to work, and her work developed very rapidly. And she began to make some of her most iconic works, which we'll talk about in a minute. She didn't show her work publicly for the first time in Mexico until 1937. And that was the beginning of a very fruitful period in her career. While she was in Mexico, at the time, Mexico City post-revolution was this almost renaissance. There was a renaissance of culture, right? The rest of the world was still in the Depression, kind of marching towards fascism and war. In Mexico, we had this birth and rediscovery of pre-Columbian arts. There was this great sense of national identity. There was this national funding and support of arts. So it became this magnet for arts. And when artists from around the world, like Picasso, traveled to Mexico, they would visit Diego Rivera and his beautiful wife, Frida Kahlo. And as they're coming through, looking at Diego's work, they're also seeing Frida's work. And it's through that experience that she began to sell work, and she got opportunities, and actually had a solo show in 1938 at the Levy Gallery in New York City, where she showed a lot of these paintings that she had been working on, and actually sold out half the exhibition. And that was in 1938, right? It's not like the US was in this big economic boom in 1938. So it's quite an achievement. She was part of a group show in France in 1939, and her work was so impressive that actually her painting, The Frame, was the first ever bought by the Louvre. And it was the first ever bought by the Louvre of a contemporary Mexican artist. Throughout all this time, one characteristic of her existence, especially her relationship with Diego, was the tumultuous nature of that relationship. Diego was always known as kind of a womanizer. He had large appetites for food, for experience, but also for relationships. And he was not secretive at all about having relationships with other women. And in fact, as early as the first year in their marriage, when they moved to San Francisco, Frida became aware of his tendencies to wander. And it created a lot of pain with her, but not so much as in 1937, when she discovered that he had actually had an affair with her sister, Christina, who was her closest sister. And that really drove a wedge between the two and caused a lot of pain, so much so that in 1939, the couple actually divorced. Now, Frida was no saint either when it comes to marriage. She had a lot of other relationships, both with men and women, some of them famously, like Osamu Noguchi, the famous sculptor. Many of you may be familiar with his iconic coffee table, the glass, like kidney bean shape with the bent wooden legs. There's also a lot of evidence that she had a short but intense relationship with George O'Keeffe, and probably most famously with the famous photographer Nicholas Marais. Nicholas Marais was one of the innovating photographers to use Kodachrome photography, and his saturated, rich Kodachrome photos of Frida have become the iconic photos of Frida. They're the ones you see in Vogue magazine. They're the ones that we use at the beginning of our presentation. Here on the right is a picture from Nicholas Marais. So she was no saint in terms of that either, but Diego and Frida still had a very deep connection and really loved each other. And in 1940, after the kind of urging of their close friend and Frida's doctor, they remarried again in San Francisco while they were in San Francisco. But at this time, when they got back together, it was less the idea that we're going to be this traditional marriage, but we're going to be partners through life. So they both continued to have different relationships, but none of them as committed to or intense as with each other. And the relationship became much more platonic and supporting each other through their careers. And they stayed close and in love through the rest of their lives, even though they had such an unusual relationship. On the right, these are both photos of Frida where she's a little later. On the left, you see her at the Blue House. The Blue House is actually the house she grew up in Coyoacan. When Frida and Diego moved back to Mexico after their time in the US, they actually moved into a home in San Angel, which was built by architect Gorman for them, specifically very modern, 2 kind of wings. there was a main house with a studio for Diego, and then a blue house connected by a bridge at the top for Frida. Frida never really loved that house, and eventually when they divorced, she moved back to the blue house. And when they remarried, Diego moved in with her there. And then because her parents were deep in debt and couldn't afford the cost of the house, he actually bought the house from them. And it's at that point that they painted the house blue, and they did a lot of other additions, including installing a lot of Diego's pre-Columbian sculptures around the garden. And then on the right, we see Frida at a show later in her life, actually too ill at the time to stand up. So after this period, when Frida and Diego finally get back together, we enter both the peak of Frida's career, but also kind of a period where she's really increasingly struggling with her health. Career-wise, she's getting an increasing amount of commissions. The Mexican government commissions her to do 5 portraits of important Mexican women, which is a huge honor. She actually never completed the commission, but it shows you the kind of the level that she was rising to in the country. Throughout her life after her accident, Frida went under over 33 surgeries on her back. Now, some of that may be related to the spina bifida that she was diagnosed with later in her life, but also stemming from the accident in which she shattered her spine as an 18-year-old. And the intensity and number of those surgeries really increased starting in the 40s. And in 1944, she has several surgeries just in that year alone, and is forced to wear a series of plaster, cast, and steel braces to help support her back. And every time she was set with a cast to support her back, she had to lay down, and her head was actually, under her chin was placed a strap, and they would actually kind of stretch her body out to try to straighten her spine as much as possible while they made the cast and while it's set. So she was literally being like stretched and pulled. And then when she was in those casts, wearing these corrective steel braces covered in leather, they're incredibly uncomfortable and awkward to move in. She did incredibly well in this time to disguise these things that she was wearing. I mentioned earlier that she was known for her Tijuana style dress. I think all of you, if we look again at this first picture, would recognize this iconic look, kind of the squared off top with native Mexican embroidery, and then like an A-frame pattern skirt. And then she would add lace to the bottom of the skirt to hide her one leg being shorter than the other, because she had a lift on her right shoe. And then also, because of the shape of this outfit, it did well to disguise these braces she was wearing. But also with her corrective shoe and her braces, she kind of made some weird noises when she walked, but she also wore a ton of jewelry, both like contemporary jewelry, pre-Columbian jewelry that Diego gave her. So much so that there's a famous story of her attending a performance in Mexico with Diego, and everyone knew when Frida walked in because they could hear the clanking of her jewelry. So her appearance really went a long way to disguise what she was going through, but at the same time, she was in a lot of pain. And one painting she made during that period is called Broken Column, one of the most iconic Frida Kahlo paintings, where it depicts Frida very much in the style of a painting of like Saint Sebastian or a saint or martyr, where she's naked down to the waist. Her chest is kind of torn open, and she's wearing this brace that's holding her together. And in the opening, we see this column holding up her head, but it's shattered and broken, as if any movement, it can just tumble apart. And then her skin is pierced in numerous places by nails. Again, like the many paintings of Saint Sebastian, where he's pierced by arrows, there's a similar feeling. But you get sense these nails are cast by people doubting her, by the experiences in her life. But shaken by that, on top of that broken column, that shattered column, we see Frida staring out defiantly at the viewer. She has tears going down her face because she's in pain, but she is not giving in to that pain. She's a symbol of strength in that moment of incredible weakness. And that painting, along with the painting of Luther Burbank and many of her self-portraits, and the Henry Ford Hospital, is really pivotal, and you think about the arc of her life, because it is from that point on that her health really begins to deteriorate. 1945, she paints the painting Without Hope, which depicts her lying in bed being force-fed all sorts of foods, which correspond to a time when she was actually being force-fed a diet of pureed food to recover from surgeries. At the same time, 1946, she's awarded National Prize for Arts and Sciences from Mexico's Ministry of Education. 4 years later, she undergoes 7 more surgeries in a 9-month period, is in the hospital. Numerous times has to spend long weeks and months at a time recovering in her bed back at home in Coyoacan. In 1953, she discovered she gets gangrene in her right leg, which is her leg that was affected by polio, and has to have it amputated below the knee. That same year, she has her first solo exhibition in Mexico. She's so weak that she arrives at the show in an ambulance and attends from her bed. Her bed was carried to the location for her to attend from that same bed that she first started painting in. And in 1954, she dies at home at the Blue House. There's somewhat of a mystery around the way she died. There's a lot of speculation that she intentionally ended her life because she was in so much pain. But what we do know is that at the time, she had gone through all these surgeries and was in intense physical pain, was also taking a large number of medications, and was drinking up to a bottle of tequila a day to deal with the pain. So regardless of how she died, it's really her body had failed her, and she died. And after she died, the same year, there was her main collector also died. Eduardo Safa was an engineer who had commissioned over 30 paintings by Frida Kahlo, owned over 30 paintings by Frida Kahlo. And when he died, his wife had this collection of Kahlos and offered them to Diego Rivera. Now, Diego Rivera, like a lot of artists, was really bad with his money. And even though he was so famous and shown all over the world, didn't have the money to buy this collection. So Diego approached an old friend that actually was a schoolmate of Frida Kahlo's at the National Preparatory School, Dolores Olmedo. Dolores Olmedo was a real estate developer and builder, and was actually the founder of what is still to this day one of the largest construction companies in Mexico City. She was a very wealthy woman. She had known Diego had posed for drawings and paintings for him when she was younger, and they once again became close friends after Frida's death. And Diego approached her and asked her to purchase the Safa collection, which she did. And that work, along with the work that she had purchased from Diego himself, work from Diego's that she had purchased at Diego's guidance of pre-Columbian work, became the basis for what became one of the largest collections of Mexican art in the world. And eventually was the collection of what became the Dolores Olmedo Museum when she donated her collection to the people of Mexico. After Frida's death, Dolores Olmedo continued to help Rivera until he died in 1957. In addition to that collection, Diego left Olmedo as the trustee of his estate, which included the Blue House, his museum of pre-Columbian art, and in addition to all the paintings by Kahlo, all of her assets and property, including all of her dresses and jewelry. So the reason I mention that is because it is the Dolores Olmedo collection that we are showing at the Cleve Carney Museum of Art this summer. And in that, we have the paintings of the portrait of Luther Burbank. We have Henry Ford Hospital. We have the Broken Column. And we have this painting on the right called The Mask, sometimes called The Mask of Madness. And this is actually one of my favorite Frida Kahlo portraits. I think everyone has seen Frida Kahlo portraits where there's beautiful plant backgrounds, where she's holding her favorite pet monkey, or Zocalo dog, where she looks regal and beautiful. This one's very different. So first, we're not quite sure what we're seeing, right? There's kind of this unusual cartoonish face, but then we notice that it's a mask, right? And we see a hint of Frida from the hand holding the mask in front, and then the hair, the intricate hair of Frida behind the kind of cartoonish mask, the purple hair of the mask. Now, masks have a long history in Mexican culture. They've been used as far back as Aztec times in ceremonies, religious ceremonies, ceremonies surrounding birth, life, and death. And they were incorporated by the Spanish as they came in and tried to convert the population to Catholicism. And they're quickly adapted to a lot of Mexican Catholic ceremonies as well. So the mask has a very a strong presence in kind of the imagery and mythology of Mexico. And a lot of those masks, whether they're used in carnival or ancient pre-Columbian ceremonies or traditions, were similar to this in that the eyes were painted on, and then above the eyes, there's holes poked out for the wearer to see out at the audience. So here we see Frida holding one of these masks. And what's interesting is the mask is kind of this mask of sadness, this kind of cartoonish crying face, this idea of what sadness is. And then we see the hand, and we know Frida's behind there, and we know that she's looking out at us through those eyes, but we can't see her. And what's really engaging is that in this painting of Frida, she's staring out at us. We're not staring at her. And what she's showing us is this mask of what she thinks we want to see, right? Is this idea of this symbol of sadness or this symbol of suffering, but she's disguised behind this mask. And it's interesting to me because it's the one painting in general, all painting I find fascinating. And I love because it's one of the art forms and one of the historical artifacts that has so much of the time and place captured in it. Because of the time it takes to create a painting, you have the maker spending hours and hours and days and months and sometimes years in front of that surface. And because of the slow pace, especially that oil paint dries, that paint's kind of absorbing the atmosphere of the room, of the space in which the artist is making it. So when I think about any painting, but especially these paintings of Frida's, is that she herself spent hours and hours touching these surfaces, right? Her cigarette smoke is caught up in that paint as it dried. The air of the Blue House is caught up in that paint. The dust from her studio is up in that paint. And just as we're staring at that canvas, she spent so much time staring at it. So this painting to me, where she's staring back out of the view, very much personifies to me this idea of time bending when you look at a painting. So it's this moment where time kind of bends in itself, and we're just on the other side of that canvas from Frida herself. So, you know, Frida is a huge icon, and she's grown into this incredible icon, partly because of her work, partly because she was very outspoken at a time where there were not a lot of outspoken women celebrated. She was kind of unapologetically feminist. She was a political activist, but she was also incredibly beautiful and stylish, right? So look, when we look at these photos by Nicholas Marais, these two color photographs, this is kind of the Frida we're always presented now, right? This is the Frida that Revlon takes and puts on their products, the one that is shown on vodka bottles and tequila bottles and is celebrated and spray painted on t-shirts. It's that Frida. But the Frida we see in front of these paintings is the one similar more to the Frida I see in the photograph on the left, the black and white, the contemplative Frida, the Frida who has gone through all these struggles with Diego, who grew up during the revolution, who had to kind of deal with all this physical pain and struggle in her life, who dealt with love and loss again. And to me, that is a much more relatable Frida, because while all of us may not have had lives as tumultuous as Frida Kahlo, we have all had experiences that are hard for us to talk about, hard for us to put words to, and definitely hard for us to share. And so when there's an artist like Frida, who through her life was willing to share so honestly and bravely some of the most challenging and really humbling experiences, the betrayal of her body, of her husband, of just the degradation of her life, but also her triumph and strength. It also speaks to experiences we have, but maybe we don't have the voice to express. We don't have the strength to express. We're not in a place where we feel comfortable. But in seeing that expressed, it gives us hope. It gives us a voice, and it gives us strength. So when I look back to the painting of the mask with Frida looking out at us, I also think about that mask as something we all carry, right? We all have this mask of what we think people around us expect to see. Like right now, I'm wearing a mask of curator, an expert for all of you, because that's what you expect, right? Later in 30 minutes, I'll be wearing mask of father as I'm reading a book to put my daughter to bed. But inside that, we also have an awareness of who we are, and we're not always able to express or talk to the needs of that inner self. And I think Frida did that and allows us to do it through her. So here's another painting from our exhibit, Portrait with Small Monkey. It's more of a classic portrait. This isn't the best resolution image, I apologize. But this is more in line with some of her other portraits. And the thing about Frida's, even her portraits, is there's so much symbolism tied into them. So here we see Frida. She's in a traditional kind of pre-Columbian shawl, and her hair is done up in a traditional style. There's a yellow ribbon weaving throughout the painting that goes from around her name down around a pre-Columbian sculpture that's based on a kneeling sculpture from Diego Vera's collection, down around her favorite pet dog. The Zocalo dog was actually a symbol in pre-Columbian Aztec times as kind of the guardians that would carry you to the afterlife. And then around her, and then to her pet monkey. Monkeys were also a symbol of vitality, of vivaciousness, of the arts, and of dancing, so kind of life. And then the ribbon going up and around a nail that appears to actually be nailed into the surface of the canvas, painted in a trompe-l'oeil, an illusionistic style. So on first glance, we see this beautiful painting, incredibly detailed and skilled portrait of Frida as we can expect from her. But in it, she's expressing a strong sense of her identity, this connection to her indigenous ancestry. You have on one side a symbol of life and vivaciousness, and the other a symbol of a carrier to the afterlife. So there's the cyclical nature of life and death, that duality, the cosmovision. And then in the end, the ribbon is going up and it's actually nailed to the surface of the canvas with a suggestion that in this space, this is where Frida can express her true self, where all these elements, life, death, the present day, the past, her identity can come together, tied to the surface of the painting. Like I said, this painting is also in our exhibit. And I want to talk a little bit about the exhibit. Check time. I tend to ramble on. We don't have too long. I'll talk a little bit about the exhibit and then allow for some questions. So this really is a unique experience. We have over 26 original works that will be on display from Frida Kahlo. To give an example, she only made about 200 paintings in her entire life, okay? And a lot of shows that travel around will have 8, 9 paintings. There's a fabulous show that's just been traveling across the country for the last 2 years, focused on her clothes. It was in Brooklyn, and then it traveled to San Francisco. And parts of it were then in Nashville and then also Denver. That had about 8 paintings from the Gelman collection. The rest was her clothes and photographs of Murray. So this is 26 of the actual pieces. She is one of the most significant artists of the 20th century, definitely most significant female artist of the 20th century. And because this is such a large event, we've been surrounding it with a lot of supporting events. Many of those virtual now. But we're looking to have this summer of Frida Kahlo. Why am I frozen here? Okay. So the 26 works that we do have are unique because they span the full arc of her career. We have one of the very first accomplished paintings she made in 1927, all the way to paintings she made in the last year of her life in 1954. Paintings such as the bust, painting in 1929, are pivotal to understanding and witnessing her development as an artist. As you see the influence from Diego Rivera and a lot of Mexican muralists and other artists into her work, into her accomplished self-portraits like Self-Portrait with Small Monkey and The Mask, which I already covered. And to give a sense of the uniqueness of this opportunity, this collection prior to our show was in Milan, in Budapest, and then in Moscow, and then St. Petersburg as well. And now it's going to be in Glen Ellen. So that's like a normal list that you see, right? You know, that's why Glen Ellen's up for the Olympic consideration every 4 years. And what's interesting, more interesting about this is the way it happened. So much about this exhibit has been about building bridges. So I talked about Dolores Olmedo and her connection with Diego Rivera. In the 80s, she dedicated her collection to the people of Mexico and opened up her beautiful palatial home in the south of Mexico City as the Dolores Olmedo Museum. It's a phenomenal place. It's luscious green lawns with peacocks and Zocalo dogs and a beautiful, 400-year-old building and this astounding collection. Well, Carlos Phillips, shown on the bottom right, is Dolores Olmedo's son, and he is now the director of the museum. He also happens to be a condo owner in Vail, Colorado. And when he first bought his condo, he and his family came up to stay, and they weren't greeted especially kindly. They were, from another country, a little different from people, and weren't treated that well. Well, there was another family in that condo association as well, who vacationed there, who saw that and did not appreciate that and thought they should do something about it. So they invited Carlos and his family and other members of the housing association for a dinner, where they all got to know each other and they all became friends, actually lifelong friends. And that family was the Peterson family. And the Peterson family are from Glen Ellen, and they're Alan Peterson was a lifelong supporter of the College of DuPage. And he, through his friendship with Carlos Phillips and his family, always knew about his collection of work and wanted to bring that work to his community. So it was through that connection that Alan Peterson actually approached us and said, would we be interested in having this exhibit? We said, of course. And we said, we'll put together a proposal, but it's kind of a long shot. We are a contemporary art gallery and a performing arts center in a community college in the suburb of Chicago. We are the second largest community college in the country, but it's still an unusual place for this exhibit. But we said, you know what, we'll put together what we can. We put together a packet laying out what the shows we have done, our collection. We have over an 800-piece art collection at the college that was gifted to us by our namesake, Cleve Carney. We had a state-of-the-art contemporary art gallery. We had a large performing arts center. And we put out what we were, and we explained what we would do and what we were willing to do to ensure the safety and proper presentation of this work. And we sent it out. And we didn't hear back, and we didn't hear back. What we didn't know at the time is that Mexican museums are notorious for being very slow in their communication. So after several months, we heard back and said, well, we'd be interested in letting you show this collection. We'd love to do it for the Petersons and for your community. And we were both excited and terrified because we knew we had an incredible amount of work to do in front of us. So we've gone about the process of transforming the space. So what you're looking at here is, this is the museum space. This is the art center. And we decided, because it's such a big experience, we had to expand beyond just showing the art. So we have also curated and put together a complete historical exhibition, complete with recreations of her bed, which you see up on the right, and it's almost completed, which was created by Novelist Woodworks in Chicago, Illinois. We've had artists, Betsy Odom in Chicago, make recreation of the corset she has to wear. We have dresses made that match all of her dresses. We're showing over 150 photographs from her life. We're giving context of the Mexican Revolution, of Diego Rivera, of the art movement of the time, of Frida's activism and fashion, to give you a context before you see the work. And then on top of that, we also have a large collection of original photos from the Almeida Museum that will be presented. Photos, snapshots of her in her everyday to get a sense of what her life truly was like. We've also partnered with Ball Seed, Bald Horticulture, one of the largest horticultural companies in the world, who are also based in DuPage County. And they have agreed to create a garden in the back of the Art Center, all using plants grown, developed in Mexico based on Frida's garden and her paintings. So we're creating this experience to kind of learn about this artist. So when you do come and visit and see these works, you have an appreciation for who she was and the time in which she made the work. Here's some examples of some renderings of the historical timeline. If you see people with bags at the real show, let us know and we'll have to ask them to check them in. There's the poetry garden. We'll have a children's area that we've worked with local illustrator Mike Venezia, who does children's books about artists, including Frida Kahlo on, which will have activities for kids, but also adults if they want, printmaking activities. Hopefully we'll be in a state COVID-wise where we can still have the in-person printing activities. And then a series of lectures and events, which we've already started. And in fact, we have moved a lot of our lectures to a virtual lecture series. So if you want to hear someone more interesting than me talk about Frida Kahlo, if you go to our website, the ccma.org/Frida events, there's a full list of virtual events where we have experts from around the country and the world discussing different aspects of Frida's life. We just had one with Cesario Moreno from the National Museum of Mexican Art last Friday night. Our next one is on February 21st with Julie Rodriguez Widholm. She is the former director of the DePaul Art Museum and current director of the UC Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. She also curated a show at the Museum of Contemporary Art in 2015, based around two Frida Kahlo paintings focused on contemporary artists influenced by Frida Kahlo. It was one of the most popular shows at the MCA ever. And then the next one after that is College of DuPage art historian David Ouellette talks about the theme of animals in Kahlo's work. And then we'll have other, if you go, you see a full list of events. We have people such as Celia Starr, the author who just released the book Frida in America. Adriana Zavala, who curated the show at the New York Botanical Garden of Frida Kahlo's work. And Karen Cordero, who is a Mexican-based scholar and author who has written numerous times about Frida Kahlo and her contemporaries. We're also going to have a lot of events celebrating her birthday. This is from our Frida Fest last year, before the COVID pandemic, where we had a free event for the community centered around the life and celebration of Frida Kahlo. And then to get ready, of course, we also underwent a 2-year-long renovation and expansion of our museum space. Here's a rendering. It is now complete. That included installation of state-of-the-art security, climate control, and lighting system to meet the standards of the highest museums in the world, so we can handle this artwork in the proper way. And of course, we've had to implement COVID safety plans. I won't go over all of them. You can see them on our website. Many of us are familiar with these now, unfortunately. So you will be required to wear a mask as you come through. There will be clear directional signage throughout. It'll be one-way traffic. And our hope by summer we'll be even in a better place than we are now, even though museums are already opening at this point. And of course, this would not be possible without all of our partners, our major partners, Bank of America, Ball Seed, but you can see the number of people and organizations that have worked with us to make this possible. So there's a lot more to tell you. And actually, if you go to either the ccma.org or frida2021.org, you can find a lot of videos that go in depth to all aspects of this exhibition and her life. And that's also where you can find the virtual programming. And if you can't attend those virtual programs live, they are archived on our website as well. So I kind of rushed through the end. An hour goes quickly, but I do want to leave the last 10 minutes for any questions. Oh, and actually, I want to see that Diana Martinez, who's the director of the McIntosh Art Center, is with us as well. So if she can unmute, she can answer questions with us as well. I didn't see you, Diana. I was in my slideshow. So Diana is obviously the head of the Art Center, so been instrumental in all aspects of the exhibition, and working on closely. Diana and I've been working close on in all aspects, and she has a wealth of knowledge about this subject as well. And there she is. Hi, Diana.
Oh, I just snuck on to watch.
I hope I did okay.
Did all right.
All right. So, if anyone has any questions for Diana or I? Yes, I see JK665.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I enjoyed
Yeah.
it so much. If we bought tickets last year, what do we do about those? I don't know. Do we get new tickets? Are those
Your-
reimbursed to us?
You should have been notified that your tickets now have been moved to, like, so if you bought the first Saturday, you're getting the first Saturday of the event. And the box office can take calls from noon to 6, and you can call the box office at 630-942-4000, and they can confirm your seats for you, or you can email them.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for buying tickets. We look forward to seeing you.
I look forward to going.
It's going to be amazing.
I think
A
so.
lot of tickets still available.
There are, the first few weekends, the weekends are always harder. Those are the most popular tickets. And the ones right when the show begins are sold out opening weekend, but there are tickets throughout the event, throughout the run. And it's June through September. June through August, September 7th it ends.
Yeah, June 5th through September 6th. Yeah.
You are all in Lake Bluff, correct?
Well, the Bluff Library is sponsoring this, but people
Okay.
are from everywhere. So
One thing I'd like to share with all of you is what's really important to us is that everyone in the area gets to celebrate this art coming to the area. And we are so grateful to Lake Bluff for hosting this talk. The Village of Wheaton is creating events surrounding it because they know we're going to have tourists from all over, from drive, from flying. And we invite you to share this in your community. And if you guys want to come up with a Frida Day, they're doing a jazz fest, a Frida Latin Jazz Music Fest. There's a Frida fashion show that's happening. There's all kinds of things. Restaurants are doing specials. We encourage you to share this with people in your community. And if they do come up with something they want to do, please let us know and we'll list it on our website. The tourism that this will bring to Illinois is really quite tremendous. We're looking at about 13.2 million in economic impact from bringing something like this to the area. And it really shows what the arts can do. So we invite you to celebrate with us in your communities and in your businesses and help us spread the word.
Anyone else?
Well, Justin, I just want to say that your mask of a lecturer is excellent. You did a great job. It absolutely fascinating, the whole thing.
Well, I have to say, Diana and I usually tag team this, and I didn't think she was here today, so so it's nice to see she comes.
Well, you handled it
So,
very well.
Thank you.
Anyone else
wanted
have
to-
to say? Yes, please go ahead.
I just want to say that I went to her house, the Blue House
Yeah.
in Mexico City. It is fabulous.
Yes,
it
it
is
is.
so
Yeah.
wonderful.
Magical.
And I would encourage, if you could go, I would definitely encourage people to go.
I would back that up, and I know that maybe sometimes people are worried about Mexico City. It's a very easy place to travel in. It's a wonderful place
great
to
place.
visit. And that neighborhood around the Blue House is just so gorgeous. I mean, it's one of the most beautiful neighborhoods in the city.
And the food is good.
Oh,
And the people are fun.
it's so great. And the garden alone, just go for the garden alone.
Gorgeous.
Yeah, it's magical. Yes, Joyce.
I have a very mundane question, and this was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
But I don't know where else I would find the answer. Perhaps she was so aware of her appearance and so careful about her appearance, but I don't understand the unibrow and her willingness to portray herself in that. Is that a kind of some kind of a feminist statement, a political statement, a cultural statement, or just, you know, was it more common than I thought?
Both the unibrow and also the hair on her upper lip, which she often accentuated in her paintings. I think were one way as a way to kind of push back against ideals or expectations of femininity. But I also think it goes back to that mask aspect, because when you see the photos of her, they're not as pronounced as they often are in her paintings. So I think it's accentuated, but she was also very aware, in my opinion, of the importance of standing out and a unique presentation. And those are key elements, along with her dress, that really made her stand out differently. And she, from a young age, learning from her father, knew how to use that and navigate that to her advantage. I think one thing that I always like to reinforce about Frida is the story is often told that, like, oh, she married Diego and he was so mean to her, or this, as if things just happened to her. She was very smart in how she made her choices. She was navigating from her looks to marrying the most famous artist in Mexico. She knew what she was doing. And I think it's important to know that and give her credit for that agency and ability to navigate in that career. And I think that goes to her parents, even the decision to accentuate those features which are commonly hidden.
I think it's all part of her brand. It's
Yeah,
all, I think
absolutely.
she created a brand, because if you look at a picture of her, they're not connected. They're not, you know.
Sunday afternoon, June 6th, 13th.
Could you say that again?
It's like the Mexican Lady Gaga.
Anyone else? Comments? Well, I thank you both, and especially Justin, for an excellent program. And I think you're going to have everybody showing up.
Oh,
I want to
great.
go right on now and get my tickets. So.
Yes, you can get them now.
All right. Thank you
Frida2021.org. All right.
for a wonderful evening. And thank you, everybody, for coming. And maybe we'll see you Thursday night for the Civil War quilts. All right. Good night, everyone.
All right. Good night.